March 7, 1945. The silence inside Allied headquarters was heavier than any bombardment, broken only by the scratch of pens and the unspoken realization that a single sentence had nearly shattered the unity holding the war together. The war in Europe had reached its most dangerous paradox. Victory seemed inevitable, yet unity, the very force that had carried the Allies this far, was fragile. Men who commanded millions now weighed every word as carefully as artillery shells. And one comment, spoken too confidently and carried too far, threatened to undo years of cooperation. This was not a battlefield crisis marked by explosions or retreat. It was a war of pride, perception, and political consequence, fought behind closed doors. And for a brief, volatile moment, the Allied command itself stood on the edge of fracture. The alliance between Britain and the United States had never been simple. It was forged in necessity, not comfort. American industrial might and manpower had merged with British experience and endurance, but the partnership was defined by constant negotiation. At the center of this uneasy balance stood General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces. Calm, diplomatic, and deliberately restrained, Eisenhower was chosen not merely for strategy, but for temperament. He was expected to hold together egos as much as armies. Across the channel stood Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Brilliant, rigid, and utterly convinced of his own correctness, Montgomery was a commander who inspired fierce loyalty and equally fierce resentment. His victories in North Africa had elevated him to near-legendary status in Britain. His personality, however, unsettled nearly everyone else. The seeds of conflict were planted long before the comment itself was spoken. They lay buried beneath months of disagreement over strategy, command authority, and national pride. By late 1944, those tensions had sharpened dangerously. The Allied advance after D-Day had slowed, strangled by overstretched supply lines and stubborn German resistance. Eisenhower favored a broad-front advance, pressure applied everywhere, steadily and relentlessly. Montgomery disagreed. He believed victory required a single, massive thrust into Germany's heart. Concentration, not dispersion, would end the war swiftly. These disagreements were not theoretical. They shaped troop movements, resource allocation, and political expectations on both sides of the Atlantic. And each decision carried the weight of thousands of lives. The rivalry simmered, controlled but never resolved. Then came December 16, 1944. The German Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, erupted through the Allied lines with ferocity. Snow fell thick across the forests. American units were cut off, surrounded, and pushed back in the largest German counterattack of the war. For the first time since Normandy, panic spread through Allied command posts. German armor surged westward, threatening Antwerp and unraveling months of progress. The shock was profound. Eisenhower reacted swiftly, reassigning command sectors to stabilize the front. In a critical decision, he placed American 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's temporary control. It was a military necessity, but politically explosive. Montgomery moved deliberately. He reorganized defenses, delayed counterattacks, and ensured his flanks were secure before advancing. To many British officers, his caution looked like wisdom. To many American commanders, it looked like hesitation. American generals, men hardened by weeks of brutal fighting, felt sidelined. Their troops bled in freezing forests while decisions appeared to stall. Resentment grew quietly, dangerously. When the German offensive was finally halted, relief swept through Allied lines. But beneath that relief lay unresolved bitterness. And then, on January 7, 1945, Montgomery spoke. At a press conference, standing before journalists hungry for clarity and heroes, Montgomery offered his account of the battle. His tone was measured. His words were precise. Too precise. He described how he had tidied up the situation, how the northern shoulder had been secured, how the crisis had been contained through careful planning and control. He did not mention American sacrifice in proportion to its reality. He did not emphasize the desperate holding actions fought by U.S. divisions, and he framed the Allied recovery as a product of his own command. The comment was not overtly hostile. It was not aggressive. It was worse. It was dismissive. Within hours, transcripts crossed the Atlantic. American newspapers printed excerpts. Radio commentators dissected phrases. Senior U.S. officers were furious. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was incensed. George S. Patton, never subtle, was openly outraged. They believed Montgomery had claimed credit for American blood. Behind closed doors, language was far less restrained. Bradley reportedly called Montgomery's remarks an insult to every American soldier who fought in the Ardennes. Patton suggested the field marshal be relieved immediately. Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. The Supreme Commander understood the stakes. Relieving Montgomery would fracture British trust. Defending him too strongly would shatter American morale. The war was not over. German resistance remained fierce. Unity was not a luxury. It was survival. Eisenhower summoned Montgomery to his headquarters. The meeting was tense, formal, and dangerously quiet. Montgomery defended his words. He insisted he had spoken factually, not politically. He argued that clarity of command had saved the situation. Eisenhower listened without interruption. Then he spoke. According to those present, Eisenhower's response was calm but unmistakably firm. He explained the consequences of the comment, not in Britain, but in America. He described how soldiers at the front interpreted the words, how families back home read them. The issue was no longer strategy. It was trust. Montgomery was urged, not ordered, to issue a clarification. The field marshal hesitated. Apologies were not part of his nature. But pressure mounted from London as well. Winston Churchill, acutely aware of transatlantic politics, intervened. He understood that public perception could fracture the alliance faster than any German offensive. Montgomery relented. On January 13, 1945, Montgomery released a statement. It praised American troops explicitly. It acknowledged their sacrifice and valor. It framed the Ardennes recovery as a joint effort. The damage, however, was not easily undone. American officers accepted the statement publicly. Privately, resentment lingered. The comment had cut deep because it touched an unspoken truth. Allied unity was real, but fragile. Life at the front continued regardless. Soldiers returned to frozen foxholes. Artillery resumed its grim rhythm. The Rhine loomed ahead. But within headquarters, conversations changed. Words were measured more carefully. Press briefings were scrutinized. No one forgot how close the alliance had come to internal rupture. Montgomery remained in command. Eisenhower remained supreme commander. The war pressed on. Yet something fundamental had shifted. In the months that followed, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany. Victory came in May 1945. History would remember the alliance as unbreakable. Photographs would show smiling generals and handshakes. Victory parades would erase the memory of tension. But those who lived it remembered differently. They remembered the silence after the comment, the anger behind closed doors, the realization that words could wound as deeply as weapons. The near split of Allied command was never about ego alone. It was about narrative, who suffered, who led, and who was remembered. The alliance survived not because its leaders agreed, but because they chose restraint over pride. Eisenhower's greatest victory was not tactical. It was personal. He held together men who might otherwise have torn the war effort apart. Years later, veterans reflected on the episode with quiet understanding. They knew victory required more than firepower. It required humility. The comment that nearly split the Allied command faded into footnotes and memoirs. But its lesson endured. In war, unity is not declared. It is maintained, word by careful word. And sometimes, history turns not on battles won, but on sentences restrained.